So it's a pleasure to have you here at the Center for the History of Women Philosophers and Scientists in Paderborn. I guess to start, if you could just tell us a little bit about this book, the most recent book that you published on slow philosophy. Tell us a bit about what slow philosophy is, maybe for those who, maybe don't know this topic or aren't familiar with the idea of slow philosophy or slow reading or those types of things.
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation, and it's really a delight to be here. Slow philosophy, the full title is Slow Philosophy, Reading Against the Institution. And what's interesting about it is if you really think about those two terms, slow philosophy, it's kind of tautological in a way. I mean, why put slow up against philosophy when historically and traditionally in the West, philosophy for us is a kind of meditative and a contemplative process. And probably from the outside, most people would think of philosophy in something like that. But the argument that I make and the interest that I have with it is that in the contemporary corporate atmosphere of the institution, what we've often referred to as the university, the chance and the opportunities for doing philosophy in a contemplative and meditative and careful way are much reduced. And so it's, in a sense, the book is actually really a cri de coeur in a way, for a return to a situation where we can do the kind of complex work that we need to do philosophically without undue time pressure. Mm-hmm. So that's its starting point.
Right, so this idea of being against the institution then is really against this sort of, as you called it, the corporatization of the academy, or the bureaucratic sort of infrastructure of the modern day university. And I guess specifically about philosophy then, some of the core things that we do in philosophy are things like reading and writing and teaching. Mm. And how is this idea of doing that more slowly, perhaps more conducive to the sort of work that we as philosophers in particular engage in?
Well, I think that the answer overall to that is probably to start with the question of first of all, what universities are for, and then what specifically philosophy is for in that context. And I think that is, we can go back to someone like Niklas Luhmann, who actually I just discovered fairly recently had worked here at Bielefeld, nearby, toward the end of his career. His work on the theory of society was a long and complex work, but really what he was saying about universities is that they are second-order social structures, and they are specifically for the purpose of enhancing, perpetuating, and exploring complexity. So that many other social structures are about the simplification of reality, of politics, of whatever concern that we have. The university's task, the university's role in society is actually to explore and enhance that complexity, not to simplify it, but actually to delve deeply into it. And philosophy's task within that, I think, is really crucial, in the sense that philosophy for us is many, many things, but one of the ways we can think of it is it's this real interaction with complexity. I mean, I think we thrive on the question of complexity. So, in a sense, the subtitle of the book is Reading Against the Institution. It's not really against. It's a cry for working within the institution in new and more practical ways, I think. So it's a sense that the institution is in crisis. There are problems, but we need to find ways around that to re-engage with the work that we've best been doing, and that is encountering complexity.
So related to that, do you think philosophy, professional philosophy, is well served in this era of publish or perish. We've adapted a model similar to the natural sciences, where the idea is to do research and publish as quickly as possible, get as much, it's about volume, getting as much written as you can and getting it out quickly. Do you see that as being at odds with philosophy in some way? You've talked about this idea of contemplation. It's like, is that maybe a bad model for us as professional philosophers to adopt? Or is it at least worrisome in some way?
Yeah, I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that, I do have a problem with that. I mean, in Western universities, publish or perish has been the mantra for some time now. That's kind of subtly moving now to impact, but an impact that's expected in a very short period of time. And I think both of those things, we can refer to these as the metrics of value. That's kind of the catchphrase at the moment. The metrics of value approach to what we're doing as philosophers is really a problem for what we do. I don't think it's only a problem for philosophy. And certainly since my book's been published, I've had responses from academics and writers all around the world. Mathematicians, really see the same problem in what's going on for them too. So I do see that. I do see the culture that's developing, in a sense, as you say, as a kind of response to the model of the sciences, as somewhat problematic for us, but probably also problematic for the sciences as well. Earlier you asked me about the interaction of reading and research, reading, writing and teaching. And yes, I mean we can just focus on the fact that our research needs to be slow, but it is important that our teaching, our collegial relations, our relations with the next generation of our students, that these be slow in the terms that I'm inferring as well. Because when you have a corporate environment in a place like a university where that's, I think, not appropriate, what happens is the major model in that environment is going to be competition. And a competitive environment in the university, I think, is not helpful for the kinds of relations that we necessarily have to develop with each other. I'm saying this for the humanities, but I think this is absolutely true outside of the humanities as well. We need to develop trust, and we need to develop a kind of sincerity in the way that we work with each other. And this is very difficult in the contemporary environment that stresses the kind of competitive context. We are literally in our institutions now, we're measured against each other and against other universities, and there are some real problems with that, I think.
And so your research and your views on this have at least some sort of a footing or a basis in feminist thought. Can you say a little bit about how the works of figures such as Luce Irigaray and Helena Sixou sort of inform the things that you've written about?
Yeah, most certainly. I do work a lot with usually referred to as the French feminist philosophers and the women writing in France. From my early work to this more recent work on slow philosophy, their work has been important for me. Initially because the question of women in philosophy is raised in their work, I think, in very positive ways and helpful ways. In this book, where I focus more specifically on the question of slowness and slowness in that sense, I think what's helpful is that their approaches to philosophy, the ways that they're doing philosophy, are for me models. So what I've done chapter by chapter is to go through some of the work of some of my favorite philosophers and use instances and moments in their work where I think what they're doing is what I'm referring to as slow philosophy. So in the case of Luce Irigaray, I think her work very specifically on love, on wonder and on listening have been really helpful for thinking about, okay, here's another way of formulating how we do philosophy. Very specifically helpful for the way we read as philosophers, but beyond that, so much more. The way we interact, the way we go through the philosophical journey that we undertake as philosophers, and the kind of way that we, in a sense, educate the next generations of philosophers as well. So our interactions with our students and our graduate students, these questions of love and wonder and listening have been really helpful for providing actual and practical strategies for how we can slow down the philosophy we do. Now, slowness has many meanings in my work, and it's not always just related to, literally the temporal slowing. What it infers at times is something like rereading or revisiting, like continually rereading and revisiting passages or books or major thoughts. And Irigaray's work particularly has been fantastic for that. The sense in which, for example, her reading of Diotima's speech is a really wonderful example of how you go through in a complex and slow way to read the work of a philosopher, and at the end of it you acknowledge that the very best thing you can do there is actually to start the process again, because there's another way. There is now for you another way of thinking about the issues that are raised. So for Irigaray, for example, in that particular chapter, she's looking at Diotima's work in terms of love, erotic passion, but once she gets to the end of that reading, she actually realizes that, perhaps it's the question of beauty that's crucial here, and having missed that out, maybe if I go back, maybe something else is going to become apparent to me. So again, that's an easy way to demonstrate to students, a powerful way, I think, to demonstrate to students the importance of not just slowness temporally, but of rereading, re-engaging, continually re-engaging, with this sense that we're not finished. Philosophy is not a process that finishes.
Well, that works as a nice segue, because your new project is titled Diotimas Laughter. I guess, could you tell us a little bit about that project in the stages that it's at now? And maybe also a little bit just about Diotima herself. Who is this figure, and why is her laughter important for philosophy?
Okay, well, Diotimas Laughter is a small starting point for the project. The larger project is on laughter, and probably ultimately the subversive potential of laughter. But what I'm doing in this first introductory part of the project, what I've been doing here in Paderborn, is to look at Diotima's work as a way of thinking, the moments at which Diotima laughs, thinking about these moments as a starting point for thinking about different ways of doing philosophy and different approaches, and even kind of using this as a bit of a pedagogical guide too for the teaching of philosophy. So to go back a little to the other part of your question, to Diotima. Diotima is, of course, very famously the wise woman, the prophetess, the woman who actually initiates Socrates in Plato's Symposium, initiates Socrates into the higher knowledge of love and erotic passion, and importantly, in this particular dialogue, Socrates gives us Socrates gives the speech that Diotima gives in her absence, which we'll come back to in a minute. But the speech is super important for Plato's work, because the theory of the forms comes in. There's a whole sense in which we get an idea of what the philosopher's journey is and how that journey is ideally to be undertaken. There's the establishment of what we would now think of as a kind of metaphysics during this. So it's a really important dialogue. And what's interesting is that this is the only place where we have Socrates' speech actually being the speech of a woman. So the question's raised of, why is Diotima a woman? There's no consensus on that question. There's much debate. And some have many, in fact, have suggested that Diotima is, a fictional character, which is unusual because there's no evidence to suggest that Plato's many other characters are fictional. Some have suggested that the idea that Diotima is fictional it comes from a sense that, well, a woman couldn't have come up with such an amazing kind of speech. Of course, you can imagine that there are many feminist objections to this. So Diotima's situation is quite an interesting one. Now, in relation to Socrates, what she's actually doing is useful from a feminist point of view, beyond that, of course, as well, but it is useful from a feminist point of view because it allows us to say, okay, despite the questions of Diotima's legitimacy or her fictionality or whatever, Diotima does exist in this dialogue. And she speaks, even if through various levels of distance. She speaks, and so it gives us a starting point to say, well, here, women are actually here and present at this important inaugural part of the certain part of the Western tradition of philosophy. So Diotima is a key figure for us, and in that sense, I think very important. Now, there are issues that we need to take with Diotima's speech. Women don't come out ultimately of her speech extremely well, but what we need to distinguish is, in a sense, the fact that on the one level, there's what Diotima thematizes. So there's a kind of sense in which she provides us with a certain knowledge about the ascension of the movement of the philosopher from a kind of physical state ultimately to a spiritual state. And women don't come out very well in that particular story. But there's also, alongside that, there's this whole methodology of what Diotima is doing and the way that she's doing philosophy and the way she's actually teaching Socrates to do philosophy. So all of the things that we tend to praise in Socrates later on, Plato's giving us the impression in the Symposium that, well, he's learned all of this from Diotima. And what are some of those things that he learns? Well, in a sense, what Diotima is doing is urging Socrates on at every moment. Socrates starts with a kind of common sense idea that, everybody knows this, everybody says this must be true. And in this instance, he says, everybody knows that Eros is a great god. And Diotima, rather than scolding him or refuting that and taking up a position of authority in relation to Socrates, Diotima actually kind of gently teases and mocks in a kind of good-natured way and ostensibly laughs at this response. And, the argument that we can make here is that what she's doing is giving Socrates a lesson in a non-combative kind of way of doing philosophy, one that actually urges the other on to think more carefully, to think further. And in that, Diotima is offering us a really helpful kind of starting point for a pedagogy or an ethics of how we interact with others when we do philosophy.
Do you think that's an important sort of methodology for philosophers maybe to pay attention to, this idea of not engaging in combative sort of strategies? I'm thinking in particular of today when, things like internet trolls are so influential on a larger scale. They're getting real public voices. And I mean, they lure thinkers into these sorts of traps of getting into combat, but they fight dirty. And so they end up making their opponents sometimes, who are smart people, look kind of foolish. And I wonder if maybe this idea of not taking that combative approach is maybe a more appropriate way to deal with people who argue that way.
Yeah, that's actually a great way of thinking about what this means in a contemporary context, because the combative is alive and well, absolutely. I think you're quite right. I mean, at one level, what I don't want to suggest is that there's only one way to do philosophy and that Diotima is offering us this rather inclusive, nurturing kind of mode. But but it's important that we know that that is a mode as well. I actually think that throughout the exchange between Socrates and Diotima, there are different tones in her laughter or her what she has to say. How she goes about saying it, it changes. But the very fact that this is an alternative, and the very fact that it's there right at the birth of what we tend to think of as our tradition, that's important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, Diotima is just one example that you deal with in terms of laughter. I know that you're also interested in Hannah Arendt. I'm sure there are other philosophers as well. Things that immediately come to mind are essays like The Laugh of Medusa or something. So can you broaden this out a little bit and give maybe examples of other instances of laughter in philosophy that that your research is going to touch upon?
Yeah, indeed. Let's start with Hannah Arendt, because at the moment what I've tried to do is really use kind of two bookends in that sense. Diotima right at the beginning of this process, and then Arendt so much later, so much closer to us. And when I look at Arendt's work, she of course takes me back to Plato. Throughout her work there are various connections and references to Plato's Theaetetus, where he recounts to Theodorus the story of Thales, the philosopher who falls down the well. He's so intent on studying the heavens and understanding the heavens that he's wandering around looking up and falls down the well. And the Thracian girl, the Thracian servant girl, laughs at Thales. And this is really an important moment in so many senses. And in some senses, what Hannah Arendt in her much later work, The Life of the Mind, does is to suggest, well, in a sense, there's this anxiety that philosophers or professional thinkers have about the fact that the common folk are laughing at them, and they're laughing at the very process of thinking or speculative thought. And what Arendt ultimately says in that particular part of the work is, if there is a laughter, it's certainly not the laughter of ridicule. And this is important because ridicule is a deeply problematic kind of response in many situations. And in Greek philosophy, ridicule is the norm rather than the exception. So the good-natured laughter that we see with Diotima is kind of a pleasant change from ridicule. So Arendt says, look, the laughter that does exist between the so-called professional thinkers and those of us that might be related to the Thracian maid, it's a good-natured one. It's just, oh my goodness, philosophers are just so incapable of dealing with the practicalities of the practical world. Whereas what she goes on to say then is that, so given that the philosopher is both a speculative thinker and a professional thinker, but the philosopher, and she tends to refer to the philosopher as he, the philosopher is also at some level in the world. What the philosopher then goes on to do is to internalize this sense of a kind of mockery or a laughter. And so the laughter in philosophy in that sense then becomes internal to that process, and the philosopher, him or herself, has to deal with the question of the impracticality of their speculative thought. So there's that sense in which she brings up laughter in really, I think, a very interesting way. But other writers, for example, Marie-Louise Knott and someone like Deborah Nelson, have taken this a bit further and said, or they've taken it in a different direction, said, okay, Arendt definitely talks about laughter in that context, but in another book, a very quite different book of hers, there is, in fact, the act of laughing. So I'm looking at that at the moment, and that, of course, is the famous Eichmann book, where Arendt is faced with such barbarity and such suffering that, in a sense, her response is a kind of spontaneous laughter. Now this is quite a different laughter to the laughter we've seen with the Thracian girl, or it's a different laughter too to the laughter that we've seen with Diotima. It gives us another dimension, and it's, in a sense, it's a laughter that is a spontaneous reaction to the impossibility of thinking through the absolute thoughtlessness of someone like Eichmann and the evil that that ends up perpetuating. So by the very end of that book, Arendt comes up with the very famous and the very important account of the banality of evil. And it's only through laughter that she's been actually able to uncover that process, in a sense, because the laughter, her response of laughter, although extraordinarily unpopular with many at the time, her laughter was a way of distancing herself from what she seemed to know about the context of the Second World War. It was a way of unlearning, in a sense, everything that she had assumed and taken for granted. And when confronted with the reality and the banality of Eichmann's position, in a sense, for a period of time, all Arendt can do is laugh. So what I'm suggesting there, and Nelson's point about that would be, not in terms of laughter, but more generally, that Arendt's response in this book is very much a kind of unsentimental response. And this is largely what people have many people have objected to over time. The fact that a woman can take an unsentimental and quite distant response to such an intense event. So what I'm interested in there is saying, okay, well, we've got some degree of similarity where Arendt's talking about the Thracian girl, and you've got this sense of a kind of mocking laughter, a gentle, good-natured laughter. But then you've got this other element where laughter is spontaneous, it's asymbolic, it's certainly non-linguistic, let's say, but it helps her to do important philosophical work. And one of the ways that it's helping her to do that work is to allow her to pause and to consider what's going on before she's made her mind up about it. So in some senses, what that laughter is a process on the way to judgment. It's not a judgment. It's a suspended judgment, or later an unsentimental approach. It over time will become a judgment, but it's not yet. So I think that's a fabulous way of looking at it. Now, throughout the history of Western philosophy, what I'm just starting to have a sense of is there are so many different ways that laughter is functioning. There are kind of tendencies we can refer to in the early Middle Ages, for example. In the Christian world, laughter is scorned or deeply disciplined, largely due to its association with bodily being. So you can see the connection there. In later Middle Ages, there's a slight lessening, but there are still issues because of the connection with bodily being. And then interestingly, in early Renaissance, you've got this liberation of laughter, this raucous laughter of Rabelais and Erasmus in response to letting go. So the embodied laughter comes into full force. Now jump way ahead into the 20th and now into the 21st century. And as you quite rightly point, you get seminal essays by women, such as Hélène Cixous's The Laugh of the Medusa, where what's being explored there is laughter as a state of defiance. I mean, you could also say unsentimentality too, but I'm interested in that sense in which laughter becomes a very subversive and defiant kind of gesture, so a fairly political kind of take on that.
Well, one final thought, so we don't stay here all day. When you mentioned in this example the Thracian girl, I just want to think about that for a minute. The laughter is about the work of philosophers and this common view that what we do isn't practical. And I wonder if that relates in some way to your work, the work you've already done on soul philosophy. And maybe there's a confusion, or we're setting ourselves up the wrong way when we use one metric for practicality or utility, which really isn't the right way of measuring the practicality of utility or utility of philosophy. Have you thought about that at all? Like, how do we get out of this trap of people thinking that philosophy isn't practical or useful?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question, and to some extent, I think that's the sense in which we have to see philosophy as engaged and engaged in its political context. And that's why it's important for public intellectual culture that as philosophers we speak about what's happening. Very clearly and obviously one of the things that we need to be speaking about now is the question of the environment and climate change, the fate of the earth, these kind of things. Certainly the exclusion of numerous groups of people from processes of inclusion, whether these be, high-level processes of theoretical inclusion or whatever. So there's that level as well. But the other way I guess I'd come toward your question is to say I'm placed in a slightly tricky situation in terms of writing about slow philosophy, because at a certain level it's a paradoxical process. One ends up, in a sense, making a case for slow philosophy, which ultimately can be understood in terms of utility, but the case is for slow philosophy as, in a sense, resisting utility. So it's a tricky position to be in. But in terms of practicality more generally, I think just the very engaged nature of the way that we can do philosophy is important. I think what's important is actually being able to communicate what we're doing in ways that don't set up this kind of false dichotomy between speculative thought and the real world. The speculative thought, or the thought that we're engaged in, is part of the real world. And probably for me, working in feminist philosophy for so many years, that's never really been an issue, because there's always a kind of political real world agenda associated with the approach one takes to philosophy.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.
That's it.